Hello, I'm Dr. Gloria Horsley.
And I'm her daughter, Dr. Heidi Horsley.
Heidi and I want to welcome you to Open to Hope Conversations, the podcast.
We believe that the greatest gift you can give yourself after a loss is hope, using this moment to connect with others who have not only survived but thrived.
So let's get started. Welcome to the Open to Hope Show. I'm your host, Dr. Gloria Horsley, with my daughter and co-host,
Dr. Heidi Horsley.
Well, Heidi, we know that a lot of people are surprised by sudden death and grief, and our guest today is one of those people who have had a sudden loss, as we had with Scott, your brother, and my son, who was killed in an accident, but it was Clarissa's husband. Heidi, could you introduce her? I know she's going to give people some great ideas on how to get through.
Sure, Mom. And we're going to be talking today about surprised by grief. And Clarissa was certainly surprised by grief. Clarissa Moll, her husband died in a fall while climbing on Mount Rainier 2.5 years ago. He was only 40 years old. Today, she is an award-winning writer and podcaster and the author of the book Beyond the Darkness, A Gentle Guide for Living with Grief and Thriving After Loss. She is also a parent of 4 children that range in age from, I think, 9 to 16, right, Clarissa?
That's right.
I remember that. Okay. Well, welcome to the show.
Thanks so much for having me.
So Clarissa, wow, you've been through a lot, and I'm amazed at what you're doing now to reach out, help others, but also, in your own healing journey. And I wanted to ask you, I know that you've written about the myths of grief. What are you finding out about grief that you didn't know?
Well, I think I came into my loss with all kinds of presuppositions, as it were, cultural understandings about what death and dying were like and what about grieving looked like. And really, my loss has shattered all of those, what I realize now are misconceptions. Things like what doesn't kill you makes you stronger, or that there's a particular timeline for grief, that there are certain things that grieving people have to do. All of these sorts of things have really been just dismantled in my own grief process, as I realize not only has my loss sort of broken the rules of dying. For most folks, we expect our elders to die before us. Mm-hmm. And in this case, someone who was young and healthy died, leaving young children behind, leaving a family. It disrupts the natural order of how we think things should go. And with such a disruptive kind of loss, I've realized, there are a lot of problems with the way our culture views grief and death and dying. And it's really given me an opportunity to kind of break those rules myself, to create my own path toward a flourishing and integrating my loss into this life that I now live without my husband.
Mm-hmm. Well, I know you talk about the physical dimensions of loss. How are you doing with that? And what do you suggest for others?
Well, certainly if you're a person who has experienced traumatic loss, it's a shock to the system. Yeah. It is something you're not prepared for. And physiologically, you manifest that in your body. Everything from cognitive difficulties like brain fog or forgetfulness, a sense of amnesia, forgetting around the time of the accident or illness exactly what the details were about that, all the way to things that are very physically manifested like exhaustion, dietary and digestive issues, sleep disruptions. All of those things are so common to the grief experience, particularly in that fresh and acute season of grief. And, I've got to make a caveat that that's different for each person. So what is new grief to me might not be new grief to you. And so each person is going to process that physiologically in their own particular way. And it's something we don't talk about very much when we talk about grief. We talk about the emotional component of that, the longing, the yearning, the feelings like anger or depression. But we don't often talk about, what do you do when people say, hey, can I bring you a meal, but you've lost your appetite? What do you do with all the food? Or, what do you do when you can't really think at work anymore because it's really hard to process mentally? And these are all very real struggles for grieving people. It certainly was a struggle for me in the early season of my grief. And so now, when I talk to folks about their own grief, I try to encourage them, listen to your body. It's okay if you need to go slowly. It's okay if you can't eat well right now. Rest instead of prioritize sleep. There are all sorts of ways that we can sort of cope ugly, as Dr. George Bonanno says. He's a researcher at Columbia University who's written a lot on grief. And he says, hey, in those early seasons when it's hard, just go ahead and cope ugly, do whatever it takes to get through. And when we talk about the physical part of grief, I think that's what it looks like for a lot of us.
Well, tell me, how are you coping ugly with 4 kids? Who are you getting your support from? What are you doing physically? What are you personally? How are you doing this?
Sure. Well, I'm 2.5 years, almost 3 years out from my loss now. And so it looks different now for me. In the early stages of my grief, it was a lot of people bringing meals for my family. It was, I'm a night owl by nature, but it was going to bed at 8:30 at night because I was absolutely exhausted and I couldn't stay up any later. It was setting alarms in the morning to help me get up, because I was suddenly the only parent who needed to get all 4 kids out the door to school and activities. And there was nobody else I could depend on to do that job. That said, I have depended on a huge village of people. I've had to reach out to folks that I wasn't emotionally close to just ask for a helping hand. And the amazing thing is that in that process of acknowledging my own need for other people, for their help and assistance, I've made new friends in some unlikely spots. My HVAC guy is great. I love him. I give him cookies. He's become a friend because he was someone that I could call when I needed something fixed and I didn't know how to do it myself. And relationships shift over time.
Did you find that there's some people that can't handle it?
Yeah, I think that it can be challenging sometimes, that some relationships that were really tight, they start to thin, and then other relationships are galvanized. And, I've really, as I've thought about relationships after loss, I've realized that sometimes those relationships thinned because I asked people to do things they weren't particularly equipped to do. I might have called on a friend to just vent emotionally, and that's not where her gifting was. She was a get it done kind of person.
You're saying something that is so important. I think that we set ourselves up when we think that everyone is going to be there for the same reason. And you were making such a good point here. Some people are here to distract us from our grief. Some people are here to play with us, and some people are here to be good grief support.
That is
and
exactly
you know that. And I think that's really key. And like you said, you had to expand your system and call on people you would have never had to call on, because in the past, between you and your husband, you were tag teaming things. He could fix things, you could do other, and all of a sudden he's not there and you've got 4 kids and it's all on you, and you had to reach out and find your people, which you have.
Right. Yes.
Now, I know that you're on a lot of Christianity kind of things, so I assume that your religion has played an important part in your dealing with your loss.
Certainly. I am a Christian. I am a follower of Jesus. And certainly my faith has been something that I have leaned on. One of the greatest gifts of my faith is that it doesn't remove suffering as an option, as a reality for people living in this world. It's not escapist. And I appreciate that, because the longer I live with grief, the more I realize this is going to stick around in one way or another for the rest of my life. I will miss my husband in one way or another. And I appreciate that my faith leaves space for that, that you can live a flourishing life, but also hold hands with grief.
Now, I wanted to ask you about your community, your faith-based community, because it seems that those faith-based communities can be a really big support.
That is very true. Yeah, there are a lot of great organizations within churches, grief support groups. There are all kinds of practical care ministries, handyman ministries, and meals ministries to help with the practical aspects of grief. And then, of course, it's just that community. It's finding new family when your family looks different now. And I appreciate my faith community for that as well.
Now, I assume that you kind of had it before your husband died. And we sometimes have people on who say, I don't know what to do now.
Well, I was actually new to town when my husband died. So I didn't have those, even though I had a history of church involvement, I wasn't really deeply connected to a local congregation. So I had to step out in the same way that I had to step out and create a village with individuals in my life. I needed to step out in a little bit of trepidation and faith and connect with a congregation in my community, just because I knew that I needed it cognitively. And so even though there was fear there emotionally, I had to take that step because I knew that it would be important for my flourishing.
And how did you do that?
Well, I began attending as much as I was able. And when I found an
Did you take the
opportunity,
kids with you?
I certainly did. Yes. Yeah. I took my kids with me. They got involved in the youth group. And as much as I could participate, I did. And when you're walking wounded, you don't have a lot of bandwidth to be able to participate a lot. But that's the beauty of a community like a church or another congregation. There are all kinds of ways that you can help behind the scenes without interfacing with other people and doing small tasks. And slowly over time, it gave me a sense of belonging. It feels like a second home now for my children, and I really appreciate that care.
Yeah, I think that's one thing that we talk about is don't be afraid to reach out to bring people in to help you with your kids.
Yeah.
Because that's a real challenge, isn't it?
Yeah, it's hard to find people that you trust sometimes, people who will be grief aware to be able to treat your children with the sensitivity that they need. And certainly there are numerous studies about the vulnerabilities of children who are bereaved, children who live in single parent households. So there are all kinds of those things that come into consideration when you're determining who will be those people for your child. But yeah, look for people that you can trust and delegate them to participate in your child's life and support you and support them.
I think you're doing a great job, being that parent and bringing in other people, because I was on a longitudinal study with Columbia University, which is where I teach. And we were working with families that lost someone in 9/11 for 10 years. I worked with widows who had lost their husband, and they were young like you. And what we found in our research is that if the kids have one parent or one significant other in their lives, they will not only survive, but they will thrive. And your children certainly have that.
Yes. Yeah. Adverse childhood experiences don't need to be a death knell for your child in terms of development and growth. They can be a spur for amazing growth after loss when they have that kind of support around them.
Mm-hmm. Well, I wanted to ask you personally, I know one of the other things you talk about in your book, Beyond the Darkness, A Gentle Guide for Living with Grief and Thriving After Loss, is loneliness. And we hear people talk about loneliness very often. What are your thoughts on that? And how can people deal with that?
It's, I think, one of the hardest parts of being a bereaved person, because grief is supremely isolating. It's a really lonely experience. As much as I can understand what you're going through because we both lost someone we love, I can't step into your story. Only you can live that. And I think the first piece of it is just acknowledging that reality. I think we get lonelier when we're striving against that, when we're not willing to admit it. I think the second piece of dealing with that loneliness is doing that reaching out, even when it hurts, even when it's hard, trying to build bridges that will bring you into your new life. And so that would be the second piece, build some bridges and create some new relationships. And then I think the third piece of it is becoming content in yourself And I think this is a lifelong endeavor. We all want to strive for wholeness, but particularly if you've been partnered with someone for many years, it's really hard to separate that. And but that commitment to being whole as a person, to releasing, held beliefs that aren't particularly helpful to you any longer, those kind of practices can help you to see yourself as enough, as worthy, as capable. And those are all the things that will help you to thrive again.
Oh, well, what good advice, and wonderful. And you certainly are following that own advice yourself, and doing a wonderful job of reaching out to the world with all the things that you're doing. Can you tell people how to get a hold of you? And I know you've written for Grief Digest and co-host Christianity Today. Tell people how to find you.
Yes, well, you can visit me at ClarissaMoll.com. It's Moll like doll. And Instagram is my social media happy place. I love to connect with folks there and hear your stories and learn more about your lives. And I also have a Patreon community. So if you're looking for more of a deep dive, you want to interact, get some live connection, I would love to connect with you there. 3 great places for us to walk together through a really hard season.
And where can people get your book, Beyond the Darkness?
You can find my book at any of your favorite booksellers, Barnes & Noble, Books A Million, Amazon, any of those places.
Well, Clarissa, thank you so much for being on the show today, and good luck to you and your wonderful family.
Thank you.
Thanks, Clarissa. Thanks for being a great example of how to thrive after loss. And I know it's not always easy, especially at night when the kids are in bed and everybody's asleep. But you are showing us that this is a journey, and that you, despite your husband's death, it sounds like he is your guiding light and is right there to lead the way. So thank you so much for being a great example of going on after loss.
Thank you.
And thanks everybody for joining us on the show today. And Heidi and I always want to remind you that if you've lost hope, please lean on ours until you find your own, and God bless.
I'm Dr. Heidi Horsley. You have been listening to Open to Hope, the podcast. You can follow Open to Hope on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. To learn more, visit us at opentohope.com and go to Apple Podcasts to subscribe.
I'm Dr. Gloria Horsley. Join us again next week for another Open to Hope conversation, where we invite you to lean on our hope until you find your own.